Good evening. This is Mr. Patriarch, joined today by Matt from Real Kingpilled. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing good, man. How are you?
Excellent. I'm doing very good. I ate a bunch of Chinese food, so I'm trying not to fall asleep. But aside from that, I'm doing okay. But yeah, so tonight we're having an interesting conversation. I hope Matt and we sort of talked about it, pre-gamed a little bit in advance, and I think we're both pretty excited for this talk. And if you guys are new here, thanks for coming by. I will be taking any questions y'all may have, maybe midway if we get some, and then maybe at the end as well. If you guys want to leave a super chat or anything, that'll help out. So you can do your part in the war on poverty by doing so. Also, if you have not seen Matt's channel, I'd highly recommend it. I have posted links in the description for Real Kingpilled, in addition to his Twitter, so you can check out all that stuff there. So without further ado, let's get started. Matt, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you, and what's kind of been your intellectual journey?
Well, that's kind of a long question, so I'll try to make it as short as possible because we've got some good questions to get into today. So I guess I'd say first of all, I'm a son of God and I'm a father of a beautiful son. Those are the two things that mean the most to me. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I was born in Reno, Nevada, but I grew up in Washington State, Western Washington, surrounded by rain. And I now live in Southern California. I moved down here with my wife to work for a guy named Jason Stapleton, who has a podcast called Wealth, Power, and Influence, formerly known as the Jason Stapleton Program. And it was a libertarian podcast that he started. And I actually met my wife through the podcast. She and I were both.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I remember listening to the Jason Stapleton Program. This was back in like 2017 or something. And I remember he was saying, yeah, and we've had people who've met through the group and got married. And I guess he was talking about you.
Yep. Yeah, he had a Facebook group associated with the show. And I started listening to it probably in 2015, middle of 2015, I think is when I started listening to him. And I joined the Facebook group, and Amy was one of the most active people in the group. She wound up he asked her to be a moderator to kind of help as things got bigger. And then eventually that transitioned into a part-time gig, just helping him with some of his back-end stuff as he was launching an entrepreneurial venture involving coaching and consulting for people who are trying to create digital businesses and trying to grow and scale businesses. So he consults with people on marketing, branding, persuasion, influence, that sort of thing. So Amy had moved up to Washington State with me, and then as he was ready for someone to come on full time, we moved back down to Southern California. She started working full time for him as essentially his business manager, kind of his catch-all. And then he needed a co-host for the podcast, and he needed someone to do social media and sales and some of that kind of stuff. So he brought me on to work with him as well. So I've been the co-host of Wealth, Power, and Influence now for about 3 years. And about a year ago, I started a show with a friend of mine. We started the show Kingpilled, and it was I'd had people telling me for a long time. They listened to me on the show with Jason, and they'd be like, well, there's stuff that you'll touch on that he doesn't really want to go into, and we want to know more. We want to hear about more of the stuff that you're thinking and talking about. You should start your own show.
Give us that esoteric, juicy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of esoteric stuff. I stumbled across Graham Hancock, and my mind exploded. And so I went down that rabbit hole. I went down stuff related to the Hoteps. So Hotep Jesus is a good buddy. And he's a very smart guy, and he's been a big influence on me as well. So there's a bunch of different things like that. People like, you need to start your own podcast. And I'd been kind of resisting it. I sort of had a lot of what would you call it, like imposter syndrome, sort of. I didn't really know, like, what would I talk about? What would be the point? I don't even know what to call it. And I was coming from a background of, I grew up in a very devout Christian household, very conservative. I was Seventh-day Adventist for anybody who may know, and very conservative Seventh-day Adventist. I was baptized when I was 12, I think, by my own choice. And then I went to an Adventist academy in British Columbia, very small, about 70 people in the entire school. My graduating class was 15 people. And it was like no mixed swimming. no sleeveless shirts. You weren't allowed to have headphones because all your music had to be approved. Is that sort of a school? And then I wound up going to. I spent about a year after high school as part of a evangelistic program with the church, and I spent 4 months in Detroit doing working for a Bible school there, and going and doing door to door religious surveys, and then doing Bible studies with people in their homes, inviting them to an evangelistic series. Then I went and spent several months in Europe and learning agriculture, toured around Rome, around Italy in general, and then spent a couple weeks in Turkey as well. And that kind of really it set my mind toward being very interested in like all things of the world. I want to understand cultures, languages, political philosophies, history, especially. Kind of from an early age, I was really interested in that. I was homeschooled as a child, and so I kind of had that super like autistic nerdiness that comes with homeschooled kids. And
Nice.
and I've
Same here,
retained it.
man. I've never recovered. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lifelong affliction. So I was, as a conservative Christian growing up, I was very, looking back now, essentially kind of like generic conservative neocon sort of. I was a big fan of George Bush, and really wish I could vote for him and everything. But by the time I was able to vote in my first election, it was 2008, and I wound up voting for Ron Paul. I wrote him in, and at that time I had just started college, and I was becoming very passionate about the subject of student debt, and realizing how much of a racket this whole system was, and that I was racking up tens and thousands of dollars in debt that didn't translate to anything specific. I was struggling, really kind of settling down and focusing on something in school, and I had this pressure of this mounting load of debt. So at that time, I heard this guy, Bernie Sanders, and this chick, Elizabeth Warren, who were talking about student debt and how unjust it is, and how student loan forgiveness, free college, all that sort of thing. It was very appealing to me but like, while I'm having those thoughts on one side of my brain, on the other side of my brain, I'd been exposed to Tom Wood's podcast, and my dad had introduced me to Gary North. And so I was on his email list. I was getting his stuff there, and I'd become very interested in currencies. So I ended up writing a research paper in college on the connection between the devaluation of currencies and totalitarian regimes. And so it's funny, I had these kind of dual passions, that one of them is like the importance of sound monetary policy, and the other is like you need to have like free college and student loan forgiveness. And I wanted to be able to argue the student loan issue more effectively. So I started looking for stuff on economics to bone up so that I could make good arguments. And one thing led to another, and I wound up a rabid anarcho-capitalist. This was probably, I considered myself an ANCAP probably by about 2017, something like that. I just devoured every Murray Rothbard thing I could find. And I was like as passionate and committed as you could get. I was to the point where I was starting to talk to people about how, like, if you read between the lines in the Bible, you can see anarcho-capitalism there, that Jesus was alive today, in ANCAP, that whole thing. That's the trail I was going. And
he's a minarchist. We don't talk to him anymore. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Statist. And so throughout all of this, I started listening to Jason. I listened to Part of the Problem. I listened to Tom Woods religiously. I was reading like everything on Austrian economics and libertarian theory, and like everything that I could. And when I started working with Jason, we would be talking about like current events, economics, politics, and stuff on the show. And then as part of the day job, we'd put a lot of that stuff away, and we'd be talking about marketing and persuasion and influence and behavioral economics and how people make decisions and trying to understand human psychology. And I started recognizing this really big disconnect between supposedly all these great ideas of libertarianism and the lack of an effective sales message associated with it. I realized that every single thing that we're doing always involves sales. We're always trying to sell something, whether it's a viewpoint or a personality or our values. We're always in the process of selling something to other people. And a key component of sales and marketing is a call to action. You have to have an effective call to action. It can't just be nothing. It has to be an effective call to action. As you're refining, for example, a sales page for someone, the call to action is one of the most important parts. You have to have your good headline and a good call to action. And this is why you'll see the big flashy buttons that say click here to buy. You have to make it really explicit because generally speaking, people are really stupid and they don't know what to do unless you tell them explicitly what to do. And I was starting to recognize that there was this problem with libertarian theory where in the abstract, theoretically, it was fantastic. It was like, this is the ideal society. This is, if we were to somehow snap our fingers and create the ideal society, it would operate according to these principles. But getting us from here to there is going to involve something other than those principles, because people acting according to those principles is not moving us more in that direction. It's actually moving us away, because there's this other influence that's happening somehow where it seems like society is deranging. It's getting more and more corrupt, and it's getting less and less libertarian. The more the liberty movement, so-called, moves along, the less libertarian the culture gets. And so I was starting to really kind of mull these things over, and I want to know how to make the liberty movement better was my desire. Like, how do we make this more effective? How do we make this more practical and applicable? And how do we sell it to people? In like, as Jason always says, he says that you have to enter the conversation people are already having in their head. And I realized that libertarians generally, like almost as a rule, were just talking to themselves. They weren't talking to other people. And when they did talk to other people, more often than not, they pushed them away. They made those people less inclined to be to want to be a libertarian or to learn more about libertarianism. And that's ultimately like that. As long as that persists, that's effectively a fatal flaw. You're never actually going to realize a libertarian society. So then as I was trying to, I'd gone on this intellectual journey where I was digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And I'd wound up at anarcho-capitalism, and I felt like I'd hit the bottom. Like I'd hit the floor. It's like, tear everything down. Now I'm at the floor.
Yeah.
Right. But then I started realizing it feels like this floor isn't completely solid. There's something underneath it. There's more here. And it was around that time that I was introduced to Unqualified Reservations, the blog by Mensch's Moldbug, who's now known as Curtis Yarvin. And reading his work had a profound impact on me.
Many such cases.
Right. Yeah. Particularly the From Mises to Carlyle, because he talks about how he was once essentially an anarcho-capitalist, not in so many words, but he was essentially there. And he at least considered himself a libertarian, and he valued a libertarian society, all that sort of thing. And he made it a really strong case for why libertarianism as a philosophy, while well-meaning, is ultimately self-defeating. It's an attempt to, it's like they've identified the end goal, but then people act like libertarians and it takes us away from the end goal. And I'd encourage anybody who hasn't read it, just go read From Mises to Carlyle. It's a series of four kind of long blog posts that he wrote. And that had a really significant impact on me. And it was right around the time that COVID happened. So as everything was kind of starting to really, like, all this derangement in the society was starting to spread, it was like corresponding directly to everything that I was reading. And I started he makes this comparison between liberty and order. And he draws the dichotomy between order and chaos. Chaos is left wing, order is right wing. And basically the pretext for liberty is order. You have to first establish order in order to have liberty. Liberty is not something that is necessarily naturally emergent. It requires the imposition of standards and boundaries and borders. And it was reading all of his work really started opening my mind to an entirely new school of thought that I'd never been aware of before. And for me, this was a natural continuation of the process that got me into anarcho-capitalism in the first place. This wasn't me taking a detour or going off in a different direction. I was continuing the exact same process. I just kept reading. I kept reading, and one book led me to another. But I found that the more that I would talk about this to other libertarians, particularly the most devoted anarcho-capitalists, I would get a response to them like I did if I talked about abolishing the minimum wage to a Bernie Sanders supporter. If I tried to introduce them to some of these ideas, I would just get this super emotional reaction from them and just get called a statist. And So that made it pretty easy eventually to just kind of distance myself from libertarianism altogether. And so it was in the course of researching and studying into moldbug, and I began talking to who's now the other host of Kingpilled, Stephen Messina. He was pestering me online. He was messaging me and he's like, where are you getting all this stuff you're talking about on wealth, power, and influence? And I started introducing him to moldbug, and he's like, this is insane. We need to talk about this publicly. More people need to know about this. And so that's how we got started on Kingpilled. We've been doing it for about a year now, and it began as a political show. It was like overwhelmingly about political theory and philosophy, but it has kind of morphed over that time as I've become. I don't remember the exact details of how it happened, but I was exposed to Orthodox Christianity, and it was again part of the same process. It's like I'm trying to get down to first principles, and having been a devout Christian in the past, I was sort of already predisposed for it. But throughout most of my 20s, I was essentially not part of the church at all. So
spiritual but not religious in the 20s. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Again, many such cases. Yeah.
In such cases. Yeah. and so I started getting into, like I said before, like esoterica, and I was fascinated by like Graham Hancock's idea of some sort of lost ancient civilization that had advanced technology that we don't have today. And I've always found things like I found it fascinating to consider the possibility of things like what do you call it, like telepathy and telekinesis, like those kinds of things. I've wondered if there's if there's like an actual basis for those sorts of things that our modern minds have sort of closed us off to. Like what's the actual capacity of the human mind? What sort of talents or skills or abilities did ancient people have that we've lost? Because I realized the susceptibility, the degree to which I've become susceptible to this view, the Whig view of history, this view of kind of like perpetually increasing progress, and that the world's getting better and better, and we're getting smarter and smarter. And, everyone in the past was all a bunch of kind of ignorant barbarians, and we're the enlightened ones. And that is, I've come to realize it's just not like remotely accurate. So then I was like, okay, well, if we have this technology that identifies us, that makes us feel like we're better than them, if we were to go back and meet someone from, I don't know, 6,000 years ago, what sort of technology did they have that we don't have, they would have looked at us and thought that we're primitive? And that was kind of the train of thought that I was starting to consider. And I started sort of dabbling in Eastern mysticism a little bit. And someone suggested something about orthodoxy. They were like, well, this is kind of like, it's like mystical Christianity. It was the way that they described it to me. And my experience of orthodoxy was like negligible. Like I was like, they're like Catholics that are kind of weird, was sort of my impression.
Isn't that something the Russians do? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the last probably 6 or 8 months of my life has been a journey into orthodoxy. And I've now, for anybody who's familiar with orthodoxy, has followed any sort of Orthodox people online, one person you've probably come across a lot is Father Josiah Trenum. And it just so happens he was someone I was watching a lot of videos of and learning from. And then I was like, okay, I need to start attending a church. Because as I'm talking about stuff on Kingpilled, I'm getting people DMing me who are saying, thank you so much for what you're doing. Please don't stop. Because of you talking about this stuff, I started going to church again and getting my life in order and all that. And I'm like, I'm not even going to church. I'm not practicing anything. I don't even have like a daily prayer practice. So I can't be talking about this stuff and having this influence on people and not be faithful in my own life as well. So I looked for the nearest church, and it just so happens that 20 minutes away from me is St. Andrew's Orthodox Church in Riverside, which is where
nice.
Father Josiah Trenum is the priest there. So
excellent.
Yeah. So that basically gets you up to the current day.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, it's lucky to have him in your neck of the woods. For me, like, I don't know, like an hour and 50 minutes away, there's one Orthodox church in Cape Town, and it's sort of like a Greek ethnic ghetto a little bit. But I'm like, hey, at least they have one.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons why I was kind of so the way I figured out about you and what you're doing is an acquaintance of mine, Charlemagne. He mentioned to me, and sort of like in this small group we're part of, that he was going to be on your guys' show. I'm like, all right, cool, I'll go check it out. And then that's sort of when I found your channel. And I'm like, hey, that was pretty cool. Let's go check some more. And I'm looking for the spicy titles, right? And I'm going through and I'm watching these and I'm like, oh my God, like this guy is literally me. in a lot, in
such cases.
Exactly. Yeah. In certain ways. So yeah, with me, very similar. Again, homeschooled. Again, I didn't even know you're homeschooled until like the start of the show. But yeah, homeschooled, sort of raised as, in my case, an evangelical, and then, just kind of a normie conservative, for like every better term, not really ideological. And then in university, I kind of became, and sort of leading up to university. So like last year of high school or university, I sort of became a libertarian. And then by the end of university, like 2014-ish, I was basically a full-blown ANCAP. And then that was sort of where I was at. And, I'm just going on YouTube and I'm watching everything on like, Mises, on the Mises channel that they have there. And, just for like entertainment, because, I'm a homeschooled nerd. What else would I do? And I'm like, oh yeah, let's watch exactly what every 21-year-old wants to do. Let's watch an hour-and-a-half lecture by Tom DiLorenzo about like antitrust legislation in the 20th century. I'm like, oh, yes, please. So that's like what I did for fun, and still kind of what I do for fun. But
scratch the autism itch.
Yeah. But anyways, I actually made a video sort of on sort of my ideological journey, but basically in like 2000, I was basically a lulbert at that point, a lulbert ANCAP. And then what happened was, I've said it to the audience, but not to you, is I started a landscaping company that I'd sort of do during the summers. Again, inspired by Jason Stapleton of all people.
Nice.
It's funny how this all sort of loops back around. But yeah, he was. I remember, yeah, because the school year got over, and then I was like, shit, what am I going to do for money? Like, I don't have anything figured out this summer, because Alaska, you can't really do a lot of. You only got like a small window where you could sort of do that stuff outside. And he's like, yeah. And then I had a friend who just, he just started a landscaping company, and he's like doing really good for himself. I'm like, oh shit, I can do that. So then I did. And while I was out cutting some guy's grass somewhere, I was listening to what was it? Joe Rogan. And that's a great thing about sort of like a manual labor job, is like, it's just an excuse. Like, I'm physical, I'm outside, it's good for my body. And it's just an excuse to like listen to audiobooks for like 10 hours a day and stuff. So it was great. And yeah, it was an episode of Joe Rogan with Gavin McInnes. And the thing that he said, it was just like a meme, but it really kind of stuck with me. And he said, Mexico sucks because of Mexicans, which is, it's just sort of like an off the cuff sort of like remark. And I laughed about it. I was like, oh, like, hold on a second. Like, maybe there's, so anyways, and then that sort of, and this was sort of like in the lead up to the 2016 election. And then at that point, I started sort of veering more and more and more to the right, I guess, politically, in my inclinations. And then I was like, yeah, maybe open borders aren't such a hot idea. And like, we need sort of a more Hoppian sort of system of governance. And, that's the only way it can sort of preserve itself, and blah, 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 blah. So I basically became like a right-wing ANCAP. And this was like, yeah, again, like 2016, 17. But then after, and that's where I was for a while, a number of years. And then after I moved to South Africa, one of the things I noticed, I'm just looking around me, and I was thinking about, I wonder if you could like sell libertarianism to Zulus. Like, would they buy it? I wonder what Xhosas think about like the non-aggression principle. And I'm like, they probably don't think much about it at all. And if I told them, they'd probably think I was stupid. And, I'm just sort of like looking around and having sort of my assumptions about human nature and sort of how groups work together sort of challenged a little bit. And at the same time, this is like in 2017, 2018, I'm getting in touch with Orthodox Christianity. So before that, I was, I kind of almost had a sort of, I never sort of dabbled in Eastern mysticism. I was always nominally Christian, but I was basically flirting with deism in sort of my early 20s. And I'm trying to like shoehorn my religion into libertarianism. And I'm like, the reason why, property rights exist is because we're God's property and God has property rights over us. Like, that's how I'm like trying to rationalize it. Like it's to that level. And I had some things happen in my life, and I think, I need to get right with the Lord. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find a church. And I had studied history in university, so I had sort of, and being in Alaska is a weird state in that it has the most Orthodox Christians per capita of anywhere in the United States because of all the Russian influence and the fact that it was a Russian colony. And a lot of the Alaska Natives are Orthodox, and so on and so forth. And I had a good friend of mine in university who was an Orthodox Christian, and just sort of the way he lived his life was sort of like a living testimony. We never like really talked about Orthodoxy, but I was like, you know what, Levi, you're a cool guy. You're a righteous dude. And, and I had been reading about Catholicism and stuff, and I was kind of like, I like the tradition and I like the deep roots and all that sort of stuff. But there's just certain things with Catholicism that I just can't get on board with, like, the papacy and so on and so forth. So I attended my first Orthodox Divine Liturgy in maybe 2017 or something. And, or no, a little early before that. Yeah, it was like 2016-ish. I just sort of attended just as an inquirer. And I was like, yeah, no, this is something a little different. And I'm a long-term catechumen. At that point, and also really listening to Jay Dyer, his podcast over the years was, and again, I sort of heard through him on the, hey there, buddy. Hey. Hey. Sorry, my son's here. All right, hold on. He's a cute little bugger until he gets my water off the desk. But anyways, so basically all that sort of thing really, hey, sugar, can you take the bugaboo? Thanks. Thanks.
I have a 14-month-old. I know the deal.
Yeah. No, he's like, oh man, I was just listening to some based content. Why you get me out of here? You're gonna make me watch Cocomelon or something? Yeah. But so anyways, exactly. You have it, Dach Breaker, Patriarch Jr. Yes. But essentially what happened is my understanding of anthropology, of spirituality, of the spiritual world, and living in South Africa, and then sort of dabbling in a lot of, you could call them like far right sources and whatnot, and learning about the Italian elite theorists and all this sort of stuff, and reading James Burnham, all that sort of stuff basically was like, yeah, okay, I need to change everything about what I think about most things. So yeah, that's kind of where I am today. But anyways, but yeah, very similar in certain respects to yours. Now, moving on a little bit, I guess one of the things that is sort of presupposed with a lot of liberals or classical liberals or libertarians is that their system yields X outcomes, and you can only get sort of X outcomes with libertarianism. So basically the idea that liberalism has monopoly on certain liberal, with a small L, outcomes that we'd like to see, right? So things like low taxes, private property, functioning legal system, you name it. How would you respond to the idea that basically liberals or libertarianism has a monopoly on sort of these specific types of outcomes? So we're not talking about the ideology, but that libertarianism has a monopoly on sort of good liberal outcomes.
The short answer would be that I would want someone to prove it, because there's no evidence of that at all. There's no evidence that a group of people adopting the liberal ideology yields liberal outcomes. The long story with this, I'm just going to tell you, my son is watching the thing downstairs, and my wife texted me and said that he really likes seeing your son on the screen.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So the young king with Patriarch Jr. So part of my process that kind of ultimately took me toward orthodoxy in the first place was, I want to make full disclosure here real quick that I've attended Divine Liturgy the last 5 Sundays. That's my first experience with it. We're in the process of building up toward becoming catechumens, and this is an entire massive paradigm shift for me. And this has actually been a source of a lot of study and thought for me lately. Is I've kind of put myself in this position where I have people who regularly watch and kind of consume my content, and I hate saying this because it sounds super douchey, but it's technically true. They see me as an authority of some type, and now I'm getting into something where I am a complete and total neophyte. I am being exposed. I'm learning from everybody else. So I've struggled with, like, how much do I talk about this stuff publicly? Because my concern is I don't want to find myself in a position where I'm giving people spiritual advice, because that's not my place. I'm not qualified for that. That's not, I don't want people to take me as some kind of a spiritual leader or anything like that. So I'm just describing my own thought process and how I've been led to this point. So you mentioned James Burnham, Machiavellians. That was, as I started reading Moldbug, he mentions Burnham often, and I heard a few other people talk about it. So I went and I read the Machiavellians, and that just completely changed my view of the nature of politics, where he talks about the formal and informal meanings of political statements, where people will say that they'll say, we're going to do, just pick your political policy. They'll say, this is the political minimum wage is an easy one. We need to raise the minimum wage because people can't afford to live, and they need to have more money. If we raise the minimum wage, they'll be paid more. They'll be able to afford more, yada, yada, yada. So people will champion the minimum wage. Politicians will champion the minimum wage, and people will focus on the words that they say, and they'll take their words at face value as this is the meaning of their words. And what I think it was Machiavelli who had the formal and informal. Or maybe it was Pareto. I don't remember exactly which one. It was one of the Machiavellians. Said he pointed out that there are informal meanings and there are formal meanings, and the formal meaning is the one that's said publicly. The informal meaning is the one that's implied. The one that's implied, the reason why, for example, a major corporation would endorse raising the minimum wage is because it puts all their competition out of business, and it consolidates their market power. So as you listen to politicians, if you are exposed to political ideologies, you have to differentiate between when they name a particular policy, what's the formal meaning of that policy and what's the informal meaning of that policy? What's the actual impact of that policy being applied versus the intended impact? So we know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and this is hardly seen more clearly than in politics. So that totally changed my perception on the incentive structure of a political system. So I wanted to go back. I'm like, okay, now I need to try to understand history in this new light. That took me back to orthodoxy. And in the course of trying to suss all of this out and starting to challenge the ideas of individualism and kind of reasoning through all this, I recognized this pattern where you have throughout the last, say, particularly the last 8,000 years or 800 years, maybe more like the last 1,200 years, there's been a move from centralization of political power to decentralization, to like where democracy is ostensibly, formally, democracy is like the absolute decentralization of political power. You might even say it's the communization of political power. And interestingly, libertarianism is the same thing. Like political power is something for everybody to hold equally. No people should be holding political power over each other. Little aside. So I saw this decentralization effect happen, and then it hit me that at like the exact same time, the same thing was happening within the church, where you had the total centralization of political power to now a complete decentralization through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, all the way up to today. There's like 35,000 different Protestant denominations. Christianity today is completely unrecognizable to someone 500, 1,000, 15, 2,000 years ago. I would have no conception of it today. And recognizing that dynamic happening in these both spheres at the same time.
I was just gonna say, why is Coldplay playing worship music? They would ask.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I was like, it can't be a coincidence that both of these decentralization effects happened at the same time. And I started thinking about it and realized that the arguments that ANCAPs make about, for example, like the Constitution, they argue against having some sort of a rigid institution whose job is to interpret and apply the Constitution. Well, this sounds a lot like Protestants arguing against the role of bishops and priests within the church. And again, I'm like, okay, these parallel things happening like this can't be a coincidence. This has to be the same effect. And then this ties into the whole Whig view of history. It ties into I'm sure most of your listeners are aware of it, but there's the video by the distributist on Moldbug where he really outlines the how Cthulhu always swims left. And taking all of these things together into one, it changed the way that I looked at how human beings arrange themselves. There's this idea that's latent within the liberal tradition that the fundamental unit of human existence is the individual. But it's not any individual. Liberals, broadly speaking, from like libertarians, communists, Democrats, Republicans, neocons, all these are all various branches, capitalists, these are all various branches of the liberal tradition. They have in their minds a conception of the ideal individual. I'll often, when I'm writing it, I'll do like a capital I individual, which is sort of like the hypothetical ideal individual, the individual that's been fully liberated and is reached its maximum potential. And they treat that individual as if that individual is the fundamental, atomized, most irreducible component of human society. And that's just not the case. It doesn't happen that way in practice, and it doesn't even hold up in theory. But all of this is a product. This is where I made a lot of waves a while back when I said the Enlightenment was a mistake. And it's funny when I said that to myself, it was like, oh, this is a profound thought, you know. But now it just is kind of like, well, duh. It was like, obviously, you know, it was the full realization of the heresy of individualism, and which there's a bunch of other heresies that are begotten from that. But so there's like a theoretical argument against the question that you asked, the idea that liberals control liberal outcomes. There's kind of this theoretical idea that even the proposed liberal outcome, the idea of free markets, low taxes, what were the other things? You mentioned a few other things with it. The so-called like the idealized conception of what the ideal liberal society would look like. There's this conflation between that. It says, okay, well, if we accomplish all of these things, then that will create essentially a utopia. We'll have a world where everyone is at peace with each other, and like there's no crime and there's no oppression. Those things are there's almost like a Mott and Bailey that's happening there, where these methodologies are being substituted for the outcomes. So the methodology of lowering taxes is being substituted with the outcome of no oppression or no tyranny or something like that. And this is a thought that I've been really chewing on lately. This conflation between methodology and outcome, and this plagues libertarians, where they say, well, if we could get everybody to be libertarians and act like libertarians, we would achieve a libertarian society. And then the libertarian society is supposed to be a society where essentially like everyone is it's not just that everyone's free, it's that everybody is optimized. Everyone is free to optimize themselves, and they're in their optimal state by being quote unquote free. And that's supposed to breed all of the best outcomes. But that's all rooted in this notion of the individual as being the fundamental atomized unit of human society. And it's not. Human beings don't act as individuals. Human beings act as members of a tribe. The very concept of an identity, I got to give a shout out to a buddy of mine, LB Muniz. He has the Been Awake Project for Better Sense Making. He talked about this concept of identity, that there's a paradox within identity, that it is both when you identify yourself, you proclaim your identity. What you're doing is, on one hand, you're differentiating from other people, and you're saying other people are this and I'm this. But at the same time, to contextualize the this you're identifying yourself with, you're referring to all the other people who are that identity. So identity is both the thing that sets you apart, and it's also the thing that unites you with someone else. And so ultimately, the idea that liberals control liberal outcomes, I think even within that question itself is a misguided notion. Not that you're because I understand where you're coming from the question. There's a latent contradiction within the question that liberal outcomes are somehow the best outcomes. They're somehow the optimal outcomes for human flourishing. That somehow liberating people from, ultimately it's liberating people from structures of hierarchy is how it plays out. That will somehow create the best examples of human prosperity and flourishing. And that just doesn't play out because it doesn't work on a pragmatic level and it doesn't work on a philosophical level.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's something, well, there's two things. So one of the kind of big conservative / classical liberal thinkers of the 20th century was a guy named Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. Mm-hmm. And he was actually in the name of liberalism, like classical liberal outcomes, he was actually a monarchist. And I believe he was a supporter of the Habsburg monarchy, because in his conception, and this is also sort of echoed later by Hans Hermann Hoppe in Democracy, the God That Failed, where if you are sort of measuring supposedly, sort of desirable outcomes that a libertarian would want to see in a society, whether it's, lower tax rates, lower instances of total war, sort of a size of the state relative to the economy, so on and so forth, monarchies tend to outperform democracies on this sort of measure. Now, of course, a monarchy is an inherently authoritarian regime with sort of a central node of power, but that's sort of the paradox of it. And as far as sort of human flourishing, that's another thing which sort of needs to be taken into account. So one of the things too that I've sort of been thinking about in terms of over the past few years, in terms of what is human flourishing. So in the past, it was always sort of economic maximization was sort of the benchmark by which I sort of would judge human flourishing. So, but if we sort of look at older forms of what human flourishing entailed, it was usually a spiritual matter. So it would be human flourishing as sort of a society that's peaceful, that is plentiful, and yet sort of has a minimal amount of vices and sort of a maximum amount of virtues. That was human flourishing. It wasn't exactly how many zeros were in your bank account. And so you see in the older sort of monarchical orders a desire to sort of have a stable system. Now, sort of a Marxist looking at this would say, well, that's just because of the class interest of the feudal sort of landlords and whatnot. They sort of want to maintain the system for their own benefit because they're on top. Now, there may, of course, be some truth to that, but these were also sort of confessional states who had a religion which sort of preceded actually their civilizations, right? So medieval France, I mean, Christianity is older than medieval France, for example, or it's older than Tsarist Russia. Yet they sort of adopt these religions and their political structures begin to sort of reflect that, at least to some degree. And if you read some of the letters, I can't remember who it was, King Louis something. There's so many King Louis.
One of them.
But he was sort of writing a letter to his son, who is going to be, the prince who is going to become king someday. And he's saying, look, as the ruler of the King of France, it is your duty as, a Christian monarch to sort of try to encourage virtue within your people, to protect them from foreign invaders. If there is a dispute between the peasants and the nobility, default, err on the side of the peasants and, then sort of try to sort of work on, you sort of use that as your benchmark, look out for the poor and so on and so forth. So I think modern people sort of tend to negate the fact, or tend to downgrade the degree to which people from older times actually took this sort of stuff seriously. And I think that's sort of something we sort of lost. So the commodification of everything, the idea that more is always better, but even if more sort of comes at the expense of sort of making your community, changing your community, or sort of uprooting people, or now we live in a society where everyone's has to like, I get a job here and I need to go there to get this job. Oh, I got this promotion, I need to go there. So you basically take the social fabric of society and then you just like shake it all together for the purposes of sort of economic growth. And I'm not saying that's whether good or bad. I'm just saying that from I kind of am saying that's bad, but I am saying from a more traditionalist sort of perspective that those were things which sort of went into the calculation of what human flourishing actually was, which is entirely sort of negated nowadays. Now, going on to the sort of next order of business.
I had something I want to say regarding that.
Go for it.
So one thing that I've become convinced of lately is that if you truly want to understand an idea, you have to understand the history of the idea. You have to understand the people who conceived of the idea and what their incentives and motivations were for conceiving it, because that will help you understand the connections that idea has to other ideas. And you can understand the context and the environment around the idea, which gives you a greater perspective on the idea itself. And the liberal corpus of ideas altogether was born out of I was gonna say a tradition. It's not necessarily a tradition so much. It was born out of a cultural context of people who were incentivized to undermine and fight back against the church. They saw ills within the church that were causing problems, and they took those to be problems with hierarchy and authority itself. That's what led there was other things with it as well, but that was one of the primary incentives for them conceptualizing the concepts of liberalism in the first place. And then where the ideology really gained steam and developed traction was through, to use a euphemism, it was through the merchants. The merchant class were the ones who really embraced ideas of free trade or the individual, because to the merchant class, who stood against them? It was the kings, because the kings would control their regions. They'd control their environments. So you had they would appeal to the interests of the feudal lords who perhaps were disgruntled or unhappy with their local monarchs, as a way of trying to break down these rigid social hierarchies, maybe not even rigid, but break down these social hierarchies and try to create new ones that would fit their own incentives. People don't embrace ideologies that work against their own incentives. So the people who are advancing the ideology of liberalism as it was being conceived, their goal with that ideology was to break down existing social structures. They saw those existing social structures as toxic, and there's an argument to be made that some of them were. But this wasn't just a project born out of just like sincere sacrificial compassion on the behalf of these people who just meant well for everybody. Their own personal and financial incentives were served by people beginning to see themselves as, well, I'm an individual. I deserve to make all my own trade decisions. This king shouldn't stand in my way. I shouldn't have to be beholden to him. And that begins to break down these hierarchical structures, which in turn starts to break down the pass through of tradition from generation to generation. And that's like what you're talking about, where eventually you're starting to just shake up the human social arrangements. And human beings, being social creatures that we are defined by our environments. We have some control over that. We can change our environments. But before we're even aware of our environments, before we're even conscious of the ability to change our environments, we've already been imprinted upon by our environments. Heidegger's concept of thrownness, where we're thrown into a culture, we're thrown into an existing society, and our 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 person ultimately becomes our identity ultimately becomes either defined by our culture or a reaction to our culture, which is still a form of being defined by our culture. So this was where the ideas of liberalism in the first place were conceived of as a revolution. They were conceived of as with the motivation to overturn existing structures, to overthrow existing power and supplant it with new power. And this is where, to refer back to the other question about liberalism creating liberal outcomes. Well, what liberalism does is it creates power vacuums, but power vacuums don't remain power vacuums. They're filled. So then there's an incentive for people who want to take power away from those who currently hold it to advance the ideology of liberalism, to undermine the existing power, to supplant it with their own power. And then you get back to the formal and informal meanings where people are advancing these so-called liberal causes. In many cases, they're useful idiots who genuinely believe in it, but they're ultimately advancing the cause of revolution to overthrow existing power structures and replace them with new power structures who may not necessarily promote virtue within the society, as you said, which is evidenced by the fact that they took a less than virtuous route toward overthrowing the existing power structures.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's one of the things that's always neglected is the whole ideological history. people are interested in the ideas, but not necessarily the history of the ideas, and that is absolutely necessary for sort of understanding. I mean, pretty much anything that has to do with politics. Like, I mean, realpolitik. I mean, where did that start? Right here, right? So moving on, one of the things I sort of wanted to ask you sort of on this related to this topic, in older societies, and this is sort of where maybe it gets a little more meaty than it already is, something we haven't sort of touched on so much. So in older societies, religion, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and this sort of goes to the name of the podcast for tonight. So in older societies, the religion of a people directly informed the sort of government they had and what that government would do. So the religion sort of informed not only the structure, but the execution of government policy, let's call it. They didn't call it policy back then. But in the Orthodox tradition, the idealized goal is what is called symphonia, where you sort of have a harmonious relationship between temporal authority and the church. Now, of course, this is the ideal. This is, never fully achieved and whatnot. But, you can certainly look throughout history and see examples of kings who sort of take this seriously. So I am here to to exert temporal authority. God has given me, the authority of the sword. How should I wield it? How should I swing it? Who should I swing it at? Should I swing it at anybody? And then the church is there to sort of, mediate on behalf of the ruler. So I guess my question to you is sort of, to what extent would you say political ideology is as a whole? So libertarianism, fascism, socialism, classical liberalism, whatever, you name it. To what extent would you say political ideology as a whole is a result of a largely post-religious Western world?
So that I love that question. This is where this has been the meat, like you said, of what's really gotten me trying to study and understand all these ideas. So one thing that as I recognize this decentralization thing happening within the realm of politics and within the realm of religion, as I thought through that, I said, well, okay, is this two different spheres experiencing similar phenomena, or is this one sphere experiencing the same phenomena manifesting in different forms or different fashions? And I've said in the past that politics and religion are essentially the same thing. And this is because ultimately every political organism, if it doesn't arise from an existing religious community, it will create one. to provide the justification for its rulership. Because ultimately religion is a fundamental constituent of the human psyche. Religion isn't something that's like a subset of your life, that like there's this all this other stuff you have, and then there's this religious part of your life, which is the way a lot of Westerners like to think of it. Which is a consequence, like you're kind of alluding to here. This is a consequence of the liberal revolution, which tried to reduce everything into its own little boxes that could be you could like pull out this box and think about this thing and then put it back, and you could pull out this box, think about this thing, put it back. Tried to isolate and separate everything from each other. So most people today think that they could either be religious or not religious, that religion is like something that they could try on like a shirt and then take off again. This is where you get the kind of like I'm spiritual but not religious sort of thing. But everybody is religious. The question is, what is their religion? Which God are they worshiping? Because your religion is ultimately the highest value that you orient yourself toward. And then everybody has a highest value, and they all relate to it as a religion. Ultimately, there is going to be some axiom or set of axioms that you take upon faith that you can't prove, you can't justify. You simply have to take them on faith.
Like autonomy.
Right. Yes. So it's fascinating. So Yarvin Moldbug is a total like the modern ruling class, bougie, liberal elite. He's like the epitome of that culture, atheist. But he was the one who first really tipped me off to this phenomena that existing, like the current popular American culture, is Christian. It's Christian through and through. It just is a secularized atheistic form of Christianity. And the way that this is what really got me on trying to trace all these things all the way back through history. I can't remember exactly where he wrote this. I've read so much of his stuff that I couldn't keep it all straight. But he described the Puritans coming to America, and then the development and the evolution of the different of American Christianity since then. And I'm pretty sure the way that he ultimately phrased it is he said that essentially the Reformation continued until the point where it reformed Christ right out of the church. And so the church remained. It just had reformed everything away from it to where now even God was reformed out of the church. But you can't have a church without a God. So they had to put something in there in the place of God. This is why Nietzsche said God is dead. And he was mourning that God is dead. What are we going to do now? Without God there, what are we going to orient ourselves toward? And that's where the idealized conception of the individual comes, the capital I individual. That is the God of modern Western politics. It is the idealized conception of the individual that everyone is attempting to embody. Everyone has baked into them this idea of the ideal liberated individual, and we're all attempting to live up to that. We're all trying to embody this. We have entire schools of thought. Our entire university system is built around the rationalist, nominalist, ultimately materialist system, at the heart of which is worship of the self. So remind me again of the exact phrasing of your question.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, to what extent would you say political ideology is the result of a post-religious Western world?
Right. Yes.
So political ideology essentially being a phenomenon of the post-religious. So obviously, I would personally say that everyone sort of, like you were saying, has a religion, right? Whether it's autonomy, I believe in the God of autonomy. I believe in the God of equality. I believe in the God of might or whatever, for our neo-pagan friends out there. But to what extent would you say that political ideology it has these implicit gods, but it's essentially trying to elevate something which is not an authentic sort of traditional religion?
Right. Yeah. So 500 plus years ago, or maybe not even that long ago, the average person would not have had a political ideology. There was no such thing. It just wouldn't have even been conceived of. Like this is like pre modern conception of democracy. So it was like, I don't have a political ideology because there would be no need for it. It would be kind of like an insane question to ask because the common man didn't direct the outcomes of the society. He was a pawn of the ruling powers of the society. Now that's still the case, but now the common man is deluded into believing that he has some say in the outcome. And this is where, as your question really cuts at this, that I said politics and religion are effectively the same thing, just kind of manifesting in different spheres. And the post-religious era is this point now where people have been conditioned to believe that they're no longer religious, and instead there's this rise of politics that's happening where now people all have different kind of political ideologies. Those political ideologies occupy that hole that formerly was occupied explicitly by religion. So people are religious about their political ideologies. These are religious sects. They're functioning in the skin of a religious sect, but we call them politics. We call them political ideologies.
Yeah. No, I would definitely maintain that politics certainly has existed throughout all time, but I think it's no coincidence that what we conceive of as modern political ideologies, whether it's, I mean, you go down the list, Baathism in Iraq and Syria, or, National Socialism, or, or Enlightenment liberalism, or, so on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these come and you can trace them. None of them are basically older than the Enlightenment, essentially. You'd
asked, you sent that question to me, and so out of curiosity, I'd never actually looked up the word ideology, like to understand the etymology of the history of it. So it's from so the Greek word idea means like notion or pattern, and then logia obviously is the study of. So it's like the study of patterns. And latent within that, like notion and patterns, it must, to me, that says like brain patterns. So it's like the study of like mind patterns or thought patterns. And the term was coined in 1796 by Antoine de Stout de Tracy while in prison pending trial during the Reign of Terror, where he read the works of Locke, curse his name, and Condillac. So he conceived ideology as, quote, a liberal philosophy that would defend individual liberty, property, free markets, and constitutional limits on state power. He was trying to create a science of ideas. So it's this hyper rationalist thing. Like we're gonna take ideas, which are this thing that's like entirely mystical, and we're gonna try to create a science where we can boil it down, and use our positivist tools to try to understand and catalog these things that are ultimately fundamentally immaterial, mystical, and ultimately religious.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, that's. I'm great. You pulled out that little nugget of deep lore. So the word ideology itself traces back to the French Revolution. Then.
Yes,
interesting. So, and of course, you've had different sort of, weirdos throughout history. I guess you could say that if you want to go back into antiquity, you could sort of see echoes of ideology with Plato and the Republic. That you could argue is sort of like maybe the birth of political ideology. But I would say, Plato and the Republic is kind of like it's a historical anomaly at the time. It was kind of a once-off.
There's a reason it's as influential as it is, because there was really nothing to compete with it.
Yeah. And, people had different conceptions of sort of how society should be oriented. But, sort of like with take India, for example, with their notion of sort of the caste system within their societies. That obviously has political implications, but it is rooted in their idea of reincarnation and their Hindu religion. All right. So based off of how you acted in a previous life, you would be born into a higher or lower caste, essentially. So there's the sort of material political realities, but then there's also sort of the metaphysical understanding, which sort of enforces the social order, which is explicitly religious. Now, with political ideologies, it's religious, but it's only implicitly religious.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is sort of how we could conceive of it. So, man, just looking here, We got a couple of super chats. I was just going to take a break and answer them just because some of these can scroll away, I think. So I want to make sure I get these. So from Al Hizzy for $5. Thanks very much, man. Thanks for having Matt on, one of the most authentic dudes out there. I would agree so far. Would you recommend connecting him with Scott Tungay? That might be an interesting conversation, actually. So you probably don't know who Scott Tungay is. He just runs a small little YouTube channel, but he was a guest on my most popular video, and I took the name of it from, I think, one of his blog posts or something. But the title of the video was "Libertarianism is Feminism for Men," and yeah,
that's fantastic.
That was his wording, and I was like, "Ooh, dude, that's juicy. Like, that's excellent clickbait." If
I'm going to use that. Oh man,
that's excellent clickbait. Let's make a video out of it. So, but he's an interesting guy. He's a fellow African American like me, but instead he's the other way. So he went from South Africa to America. Yeah, I'll send you his details. You can sort of check out his channel, but he might make an interesting guest on your show, because a lot of the stuff he talks about, he considers himself to be sort of a Christian nationalist, and kind of, I guess, around the same sort of time frame as me. His thinking changed a lot, and he used to be, again, like a libertarian and ANCAP and so on and so forth. But he's a really cool guy, excellent speaker, and yeah, I'll send you his details. So
cool.
Thanks for that, Al Hizzy. I think I will see if I can't connect these two boyos. Now from Avolok for $2 or 2 rands. I'm not sure what that is. Either way, thanks, bro. Carlyle is successor to Hoppe. I would kind of say so, because in a certain sense, because Hoppe kind of gets a lot of the practicalities. You could think about it sort of the public choice analysis of power and so on and so forth, and sort of the importance of culture and whatnot. But then Carlyle is sort of more like, in terms of at a certain point, Carlyle is willing to say, yeah, they must be forced to do X.
Right.
And I don't think necessarily Hoppe is. Hoppe is, of course, would not tolerate covenant communities and or tolerate certain dissidents within his covenant community. But I think Carlyle definitely goes beyond that. Carlyle is definitely not an anarcho-capitalist, even the base kind like Hoppe. Carlyle is also, how would I say, he's critical of capitalism. So Carlyle is weird because leftists like him because he's like, oh yeah, he's Reagan on the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, he's one of us. But then he's like, yeah, and also I'm like majorly racist, and like inequality is a myth, and you know, so on and so forth. Like, oh no, Carlyle, no, don't. He's like that uncle you invite, like for leftists, he's like that an uncle you invite over and then you're having fun. And then he's like, yeah, and then about those people, you know. Carlyle's kind of like that. So I would say Carlyle is not successor to Hoppe, but maybe the fulfillment.
It's almost like you need, like if you're gonna read one of them first, if you're just coming from the West, I would say read Hoppe first. And then, because if you read Carlyle and then without reading Hoppe, then you probably won't get as much out of Carlyle. But if you've been broken down completely by Hoppe, some of your defenses to Carlyle will be broken down as well.
Yeah, no, and one of the great things about libertarianism is it's a good gateway drug in a lot of ways. So it gets you attuned to like
weed,
you know, digging into ideas and like things that aren't necessarily popular, and it's a nice it's a safe rabbit hole, and it's, you know, it's the one dissident opinion you're kind of allowed to have, which should tell you a lot about sort of how dangerous they actually think libertarianism is. But it's good programming, I guess. It's training. So it's libertarianism is like karate class, and then like moving on from that, you know, studying reactionaries and whatnot is like Jeet Kune Do or something. It's like Bruce Lee martial arts. Now let's continue to Cooper. Thanks, man. $5. Thanks for having Matt on, Mr. Patriarch. It's a pleasure to join your circle this afternoon. Well, thanks, Cooper. I don't believe I've seen you here before. Thanks for the super chat, man. And I got a whole lot of back catalogs of edited videos and stuff. So welcome to check that out, and hope I see you around again.
Cooper's my boy. He's one of the guys. Yeah, he was actually when we started a supporting listeners group with Kingpilled, he's the first person to join, and he's nice. Right at he's almost at the same spot as where I am in terms of politics and religion. He's now inquiring Orthodox, and I learn stuff from him every time I talk to him. He's a good
all
guy.
The best guys are becoming Orthodox these days. I swear,
yeah,
it's great. Love to see it. You love to see it, as Brother Augustine is fond of saying. No, that's cool. And yeah, as far as I guess I'll just sort of make the plug mid video, because I guess that's good for marketing and stuff. But if you guys are interested in sort of getting access to sort of the Telegram group and whatnot, you can definitely get into that at subscribestar.com, Mr. Patriarch. I'll be releasing some exclusive content. I already have one video out, and we're just a few dineros away from me making a couple more. So if you guys want to go check that out there, I'm also available to be reached on the app. So if you got any questions, anything you really want me to know, any great guests you want to have on, I get a lot of messages and stuff, and this is just a good way to sort of filter it from all the messages I'm bombarded with. So yeah, you can reach me on subscribestar.com, Mr. Patriarch. All right, moving on. So, okay, so this is kind of the task of this is kind of our task, I would say, is sort of, based in red-pilled Christian dudes, is sort of how do we step over political ideology to bring into being a more, based society? And sort of, will faith have to be the cornerstone of such an endeavor? So two-part question. So number one, how do we get over political ideology in order to bring about the world we want? And second one, how fundamental is religion to that operation?
This is I'll say at the outset that I don't think I have an answer to this yet. This is something that I'm looking for. Yeah. This is something I'm trying to figure out. And this is where I've started getting a little, kind of a little squeamish, trying to, as I've started exploring some of these ideas, there's stuff that I've decided not to talk about publicly because I can't give myself a clear line at which I'm straying into like giving spiritual advice or potentially like theologically innovating or that kind of thing. And I want to stay far away from that. We had a meeting a couple days ago with Father Josiah, and I asked him not this question per se, but just kind of similar. And because I've been really caught between, there's kind of two different segments of orthodoxy that I've been influenced by and listened to, and especially as these overlap with libertarian anarchist kind of sentiments. And one of them is kind of like you're essentially like, this world is fallen. If you're placing your hope and your faith into institutions of man, you're going to be let down. And that time and effort put into attempting to politically innovate is basically time engaged in idolatry, and that's time that should be spent on drawing near to Christ. And then the flip side is that it's our responsibility as Christians to take proactive roles as leaders in our communities, that there's going to be leaders no matter what. You're not going to do away with leadership. You're not going to do away with political power. It's going to be there. And to say that Christians shouldn't be acquiring political power is to say that only non-Christians should have political power. And that just doesn't, I haven't been able to square those ideas yet. I still have the latent ANCAP in the back of me that sends up all these red flags that I'm still, it's kind of like I'm going through counseling to try to get all these like old triggers out of myself. But I have that the kind of these two wolves that are fighting in my mind. And it was interesting talking to Father Josiah, because he is definitely of the latter category. One of the first things that he said was that he encourages all of his parishioners to take an active role in their communities, to get elected to political office, to sit on committees, to know their politicians, to talk to them, to influence them. And part of this goes with the idea that seems fairly unique to orthodoxy, which is that there's a role of like your priest will come to your house and will bless your house and exercise your house, and that there's a role for Christians in doing that in their communities in general, and like taking back territory for Christendom, and purifying the territory by
the Reconquista starts here.
and that idea is compelling to me. I see that as I see that as compelling. It's also really like rife with potential danger. And actually, speaking of Cooper, he and I were talking about something like this just yesterday, and I highlighted something that he told me, because I wanted to, as soon as he said this to me, as soon as he put these words together, it really just clicked in my mind. And it relates to what Father Josiah told me, because Father Josiah said ultimately, all of the rest of that stuff matters less than your own humility. That it begins with you being humble and dropping to your knees before Christ and submitting yourself to his will. As long as you are being humble, as long as you are practicing humility, then he will guide you. Christ will guide you. Because my wife and I are really grappling with some major life decisions right now. We're trying to decide whether or not to relocate. We're trying to decide whether to make this career move or that career move. And both of us being very new to the church, we're seeing this as obviously a time where our faith is being tested. And so this idea of Christians essentially being involved in trying to move beyond political ideology, but trying to reform their societies as well. It has the potential for becoming, if it becomes your all-consuming focus and it's your primary goal is like, I'm going to reform my society, then you don't have your gaze set high enough. And this is what Cooper said. He said, whether you aim for a perfectly free society or a perfectly ordered society or a perfectly prosperous society, etc., whatever your perfectly is, you will fail disastrously because you're not aiming high enough. If your aim is properly fixed upon the Most High, then your world will be exactly as free, exactly as ordered, exactly as prosperous, etc., as it's supposed to be at that time, as those lesser principles are put within their proper places. And that just
based.
Yes. So I think that's where I'm at with this right now. That and it's related. It's kind of where the idea of Kingpilled came from in the first place. So it was a political thing when we first started, and we're talking about moldbug and monarchy and all that. But there was kind of an intentional double meaning that was in there, because I think part of me knew that eventually we were going to be moving away from politics and more into the religious sphere, and that ultimately Christ is king, and through him we are called to positions of leadership. We are called to be leaders, whether it's just in our own families or in our communities, more broadly speaking. Ultimately, community is just a macrocosm of the family, and the society is a macrocosm of the community, and then civilization is a macrocosm of society. So all of this starts with the family, and ultimately it starts with the father, the man, Mr. Patriarch. The man is responsible for being the patriarch of his family, for being the king of his family, taking control of his territory, and consecrating his territory to Christ through perpetual communion and humiliation before him. And as you embrace that, as you move forward in that capacity, then I think it's pretty clear that God will work through whom he's going to work through to accomplish whatever he's going to accomplish. And if that means, reviving the Imperium, then that will happen. That will happen because it is God's will that happen. And if it's not, then that's because he has something different or something better planned. Part of my interest right now that I grew up as a as a young Earth creationist, very much like being Seventh Day Adventist, a very young Earth creationist, Earth 6,000, 10,000 years old,
Yeah, me
something
too.
like that. Yeah. And then throughout my 20s, really, I completely just moved away from that altogether. And
we're tadpoles, man. Yeah.
and now I'm kind of like, maybe the Earth is younger than I thought. Now I'm like open to anything. It could be absolutely anything.
Yeah.
My real question, the thing I want to know is, like, people talk about us living in the end times, and the apostles thought that they were living in the end times, and to a degree they were. It's that our conception of the end times isn't God's conception of the end times.
Right.
And so does the end times, it's lasted for 2,000 years so far. Is it going to be another 2,000 years, 20,000 years, 100,000 years? Who knows? Who knows how long we're going to be here? And like, if I knew that, obviously I would never know this, but if I knew that second coming was in 10 years, something like that, then I'd be like, yeah, no, don't even bother trying to rehabilitate your communities. The flood is coming. Build the ark, hunker down, protect your own. Yeah, repent, protect your own. And yeah, but I don't think there's any reason to believe that's the case. I don't think there's any reason to believe that the end of the world is nigh. As far as I can tell, we're going to be here for the foreseeable future. We're going to live our lives, and those lives are going to be relatively more or less difficult. Father Josiah said the first thing he told us was after we laid out our questions with him. He said, first of all, you guys are going to be just fine. Hopefully, for your sake, you die soon as martyrs, but that's not likely. More likely, you're going to live your whole life. You're going to have your children, grandchildren, etc. And he said, Orthodox don't run. We don't hide. We don't shrink. He said, we're not the Amish. He said, I love the Amish. We're not the Amish. He said, we are called to positions of leadership. But before you can take a position of leadership in your community, you have to first take that position of leadership in your own life. And ultimately, I guess that would be the Kingpilled, that you can make lots of arguments for the superiority of monarchy over democracy, but ultimately the quality of governance within a society depends upon the quality of the people within that society. And the quality of the people within that society depends heavily on the quality of the leadership within the society, which in turn depends heavily on the quality of the men in the society.
Yeah. And whether or not they're willing to submit to God and his, and his will, or try to impose their own on the world.
Right.
Yeah. As far as Christians in politics, yeah, I was, and this is one of the big things that sort of inoculated me on a lot of the, I guess, sort of my libertarian positions or my ANCAP positions on politics, was essentially orthodoxy in large part. And it's very simple. I mean, all you got to do is look and you see a number of kings, soldiers, emperors who are literal saints, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can clearly infer from that. And also, even if you read the Bible, the Bible is also pretty clear on this. At this back in the day, I try to I'd either skip those parts, not read them, or try to what they really meant. I'm trying to basically out-lawyer God.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the traditional understanding of these passages. Try to read my own sort of interpretations on them. But really, I think you're right. I think what we have to do is be humble, right? Don't go in there, swinging dick, thinking we'll just sort of fix everything and make it all what we want to do because we know what's best, but rather to sort of allow God to work through us. And that might sound hoity-toity, like we're like, oh, he thinks he's being led by the Holy Spirit. What an asshole. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that's going to happen to people.
Yes.
And it can happen to you. And you need to be willing to sort of submit if that is what God's plan is for your life. So, I mean, he can take a shepherd boy and make him king of Israel. He could take, nobody from the city of Ur Uruk, and he can create the Jewish race and the line of the Messiah out of that. These things happen. And, he can also show the Emperor of Rome, a cross in the sky that says, by this sign, go forth and conquer,
Right.
So all these sorts of things can happen. And you need to be willing to, so first off, why is the serpents innocent as doves? And again, bend your knee to God first and foremost. And then when you're willing to do that, he will sort of lead you in wisdom to sort of show you what your specific path is going to be. Now, I'm not saying I'm great at this. All I'm saying is this is sort of what the church teaches. And I'm just trying to get my own life in sort of alignment with that.
Right.
Now, as far as kind of how we deal with with our situation sort of at a national level going forward, talk about a problem. I think it's sort of one of those things, like part of me is sort of torn. Like on the one hand, I want to sort of, for the sake of the remnant, right? I want to sort of save the United States and, make it sort of more stable, peaceable, righteous society and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, a big part of me is like, yeah, America deserves it to a certain extent. And it's just like, so again, I'm not exactly sure sort of, and again, sort of my studying of like elite theory and, democracy and sort of how it works and how financial power is power. And if you destroy that, then there's all these sort of downstream effects. And so it's just a massive problem that we have to deal with. And I don't have the exact answer. I don't think, some people can say that they do, but on my part, I think the only thing we can do is sort of be willing to sort of recognize that if we are willing and if we, sort of keep the faith, we can be used as tools of the Holy Spirit. And not only that, but also God has given us the ability to discern good and evil. And to the extent that we are able to resist that within our own lives and protect our own communities with our capacities, I think we are sort of called to do that. But as far as like the bigger picture, like who's going to be president or whatever, I have no idea. Like it would be really cool if like, someday, some based ortho bro just like gets a divine vision, runs for president, and then he says, I am the Senate, and then just like disbands the Constitution or whatever. Hey, that could happen. Like crazier things have happened, but I have no idea how it's going to work out. So yeah, man.
The verse that has clanged around in my head as I've thought about this is James 1:27. That religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And I've always thought that it's interesting. Those two ideas are almost, if you think about them within a political context, there's almost a tension between them. So it's essentially caring for the oppressed and downtrodden, those who have no one to advocate for them, advocating for those for whom no one else will advocate. Because that's what an orphan and a widow within the society at the time that this was written would have had no legal advocates. They would have had no political advocates. And they would have been like those were like I'm just thinking of this right now. And I think those have been like basically the two prototypes or archetypes of the people within the society that had no advocate. So religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to advocate for the oppressed who have no advocate, yet also keep oneself unstained from the world. So that's something that I've been when I hear people talk about, Christians or libertarians or whatever else they have no business getting involved in the political system, no business. Like the political system is not just a political system. The political system is for all of its issues, all of its corruption and everything, it's still a system for leadership that people follow. And at the national level, yeah, there's lots of arguments, lots of pragmatic arguments why the national level is just a total waste of time, not even worth getting into. But at the local level, individual people can still make a big difference at the local level. And there is, if you're in a local community and you have the opportunity to take on a position of leadership and to remove the burden of corruption and oppression from whatever institution it is, whether it's a public institution or a private institution, which is a fake distinction. They're just institutions. If you have an opportunity to move into a position of leadership like that and to advocate for those who otherwise have no advocate within our given political legal system, the way that advocacy is determined is through this process. So the process sucks. The process is corrupt. But if it's ever going to be reformed or replaced or anything like that, it's going to require people who are already in positions of influence and leadership. This is part of the message of the other show that I'm on, Wealth, Power, and Influence. It's that the people with wealth, power, and influence are the ones moving the world. That's how it is right now. And that's how it always is. We are explicitly called to advocate for those for whom there is no advocate. And also, to him who knows what is good and does not do it, it's sin. So if you're in a position where you're being called to a position of leadership, you're being called to a position to advocate for those for whom there is no other advocate, or those for whom their advocates have abandoned them or are abusing them, then if you're being called, and if you are, like we said, if you're practicing humility and you're following the guardianship of your own spiritual father, the leadership of the church, and you're being called to a position of authority in a secular institution, then by all means, take that responsibility on. This is ultimately the libertarian view of power is so distorted and corrupt. Power is not abusive in and of itself. It's inevitable. There's always going to be power. You're not going to abolish power. Power ultimately is responsibility and authority. Someone is going to have that responsibility. The problem with the democratic system is that it obscures the actual responsible party. It's the entire system is built essentially to pass off responsibility endlessly in an endless regressive.
It's a smoke screen for elites. Yeah,
right. Exactly. So ultimately, power is not like this thing that, you crave it because all the stuff that I can do. Power is a responsibility that's entrusted to people. And most people betray that responsibility. They don't deserve the power that they have. But the answer to this then isn't, well, the people who would be responsible for that with that power shouldn't have it. Nobody should have it. Well, okay, so that's the application of that. You got this formal and this informal meaning. The application of that is that only people who are irresponsible with power will hold power. And I can't wrap my mind around how that could possibly be prescriptive in any sense.
No, it's based on the presumption that the ring exists and so does Mount Doom, but really there's only the ring and there is no Mount Doom.
Right. Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, I mean, you need I love my libertarian friends, but there is no Mount Doom. You can try and take the ring far away. You can throw it in the ocean, or whatever. But eventually, it's going to bubble up. Some fish is going to get it, and then Smeagol's going to get it, and then we know what happens after that, right? So that's essentially the issue we find ourselves in terms of temporal power. It's an inevitability. And one of the things that I realized, sort of studying history and whatnot a bit, people like Carol Quigley and Tragedy and Hope, and sort of the roots of the sort of Anglo-American establishment, as you could call it. And even before that, you look throughout history, basically where there is wealth, there is power. And generally speaking, power doesn't want the free society that libertarians want. And as a result, it never happens.
Yes.
So it's simple as that. So it's the idea that, power is the state. No. The state is merely the apparatus by which the elite, whoever they are, sort of execute sort of their plans for society. And those can be good or bad. So in the advent of sort of the collapse of the state, you'll have one of two things happen. You'll have either sort of mass chaos, and then people will cry out for a savior or a strong man to sally forth and, save them. And then, what happens after that? Or basically the people with money and the ability to do so will immediately sort of cobble together their own thing, like overnight, just because that's sort of the way it works. And then you'll be like, all right, cool, this is ours, so on and so forth. So anyways, and this idea of sort of shirking responsibility, that was the whole that was kind of the underlying whole message for the libertarianism is feminism for men video that I talked about, that we did. Is feminism for women is essentially a way for women to get what they want in a certain sense while shirking responsibility. Responsibility to their family, responsibility to their husband, responsibility to God, responsibility to their community, so on and so forth. Libertarianism is a shirking of responsibility for men, in the sense that we see disorder, we see chaos, we see evil. We know that somebody should do something about that. It could be us. And if we're in the position to sort of do something about that, and again, with humility and sort of led by the Holy Spirit, if we say no to that because politics is icky, that's cowardice masquerading as virtue in a certain sense. And also, again, it's a shirking of responsibility. I have all the right ideas up here, but if I do that, then it's basically the if we win, or no, if we win, our enemies win sort of mindset.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yes. Which is kind of strange. You're identifying yourself with your enemies. That's kind of kind of weird. Yeah.
So if we win, if they lose, if we win, they win sort of mindset. Yeah.
It's it's kind of like the you talked about how the liberal ideology is sort of like it's like a tool for the ruling elite to, number one, to weaponize against other members of the ruling elite when the time arises. The whole circulation of the elites and the fact that, like, in every revolution, the mythology is that in every revolution, it's like the people who are overthrowing the ruling powers and establishing a new one. But invariably, in every single case, it's one segment of the existing elite weaponizing the people in a populist fashion to overthrow a different segment of the ruling elite. So it's really just members of the ruling elite rearranging themselves. And so liberalism, on one hand, it serves as a potential weapon in the bag for the elite to use against each other. On the other hand, it also serves as a like a filtering mechanism. It's almost like the crabs in a bucket that are pulling each other down. As long as you have this liberal mind virus in people, then those who are striving or aspiring to greater and greater responsibility, and accordingly receiving power in return, because you can't have great responsibility without great power. There's now this like mind virus that tips people off to like, no, that's too much responsibility. We're going to pull you back down into the bucket. And they all keep pulling each other back down. So ultimately, the people start winding up inadvertently doing the bidding of the very people who they claim are the ones who are oppressing them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was also sort of one of the big sort of eye openers to me, is looking throughout history at all the sort of revolutions. Every single one of them, pretty much without exception, has always been sort of one group of the elite sort of targeting the other. And again, like you say, weaponizing, using the people as a blunt instrument to beat their rivals with. The only one that I could think of, which was kind of not, was sort of the Haitian Revolution, the slave uprising in Haiti. But that was, again, sort of like the top slave sort of recognizing weakness in the system and saying, hey, look, there's very few guards. Come on, I'm charismatic. I'm sort of like the natural elite of the slaves. Let's sort of like overthrow everybody. So
it was almost There was the managerial class, because the top slaves were like the managers. So it was the managerial class weaponizing the serfs against the aristocracy or something like that.
Yep. No, that's another great point. Now, sort of going on to question number 6. The other day, I was listening to a talk. It was talking about aesthetics and sort of the role that plays for, the right sort of going forward into the future. And one of the guys said, I thought it was a really cool quote. He said, he was quoting actually a communist. And the quote goes that the left seeks to politicize aesthetics while the right seeks to aestheticize politics. So, sort of with that in mind, to what extent do you think we're guilty of inflicting our ideology onto our religion rather than inflicting religion onto our ideology, generally speaking?
So this question, when I read it, it's one of those things that whenever I don't know what you would call it, these things where, politicize aesthetics, aestheticize politics, where it's kind of like you're taking these things and like flipping them and like connecting these two different I don't know what you would call that. But it strikes me as like the type of thing where someone thought of the first one. Someone thought of like the left seeks to politicize aesthetics, and so then they were kind of like, well, what if the opposite is true? And I see, yeah, the comment is, I think it's a false dialectic. I think that there's a measure of truth to it. It strikes me as that the first one was something that was conceived of, and then someone like tagged the second one on to see if it works. That sort of thing, just naturally, it tickles my brain. It makes my brain feel good when I see something like that. So I love when I think of things like that, and then I love when I read them with other people. So what stood out to me with the question is that there's a power differential between politics and aesthetics. There's also a time differential, and a friend of mine, he's in the live chat. I saw him on Popular Liberty. He has a really interesting theory of power. He's called archotropism, which talks about basically how the state breeds chaos to create a pretext for imposing order, and this is how the state expands itself. It's a very elaborate theory that he's put together using the laws of thermodynamics, and he applies interest rates to power to illustrate why the Constitution actually made it inevitable that we'd have this vast overarching totalitarian state. By placing a
high IQ analysis.
Yeah.
High IQ power analysis.
Yeah. So one thing that he points out is that the left operates as they are fundamentally predators. So they have a high time preference. The right are fundamentally producers. They have low time preference. And what was interesting here is that aesthetics are ultimately like a low time preference form of power. Because as your aesthetics
right.
work slowly over time as they influence people the way that people think. Politics is a high time preference. So politicizing something is a high time preference action because you're trying to derive power. You're trying to cash out power now at the expense of saving it and cashing it out later on when there's more of it. So I think that there's a directional accuracy to this. That the whole thing about aesthetics is something relatively new to me as I've kind of entered the dissident right sphere of thought. And I've started following a bunch of people that are talking about like architecture and that sort of thing. Because art has never really been a thing that really, like, I really love music. I played music growing up and stuff, and I always was really interested in it. But like poetry has never, I've always been like, I can't wrap my mind around it. It doesn't interest me. And so aesthetics in general is something that I'm kind of just starting to like learn and study. But yeah, so to what extent do you think we're guilty of inflicting ideology on our religion and religion on our ideology? This kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where it's kind of substituting one for the other. And there's definitely a lot of idolatry happening right now. Liberalism is fundamentally an idolatrous Christian heresy that worships the self, and so I can see within that the dangers of like aesthetics being can take you in that direction. At the same time, like coming from a sort of Seventh-day Adventist and then Reformed, just like a Protestant background, and then attending an Orthodox church, clearly aesthetics are a consideration. There's scent, sight, sound, all of your senses are taken in by the worship experience. And it's something that I think is profoundly beautiful. And it almost feels like there is this within Protestantism, especially, there's a lot of this what's the word I'm thinking of? Asceticism, or like if something
minimalism.
Yeah.
Minimalism with they don't want it too arty, otherwise it's idolatry.
Right. But then what's fascinating is that a Protestant church service is so much about the expression of the individual
Right.
singing, the individual reading, the individual preaching. All these things are all focused on the individual. So there's kind of a funny tension there. But yeah, those were the thoughts that question sparked for me.
Cool. Yeah, sort of with me is the idea. So the communist who said it is the politicization of aesthetics tends to be, though not always, kind of a left-wing thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can see this in like Soviet realism. You can see this in like the really bad modern like Netflix comedy specials where it's just like all, and like the perfect example right now is like Santa Inc. Like if you've seen that, I haven't watched the show, but if you've seen the trailer, that's the perfect example of politicization of aesthetics. So you're taking sort of something which is supposedly a piece of art and like shoehorning your politics in it.
Mm-hmm.
And what that tends to do is that tends to sort of degrade, in my opinion. Usually it'll sort of tend to degrade the thing, and it's kind of blunt and whatnot. And that's sort of a typical leftist way of trying to engage in this subconscious psyche of sort of the masses. Now, what he said is sort of, so the inverse of that, the aestheticization of politics. And this, again, he's a communist, so this is his language. So he says, the aestheticization of politics is inherently fascist and must be avoided. And what I think is what we're kind of trying to do is, we're kind of in that position. So what we want to do is and this is again related to sort of the podcast I was listening to the other day. A lot of the disgust and it is disgust that we have sort of for modern society and whatever is essentially partially it's sort of aesthetic. We see things, they're ugly, we think they're sinful, they're sort of immoral, they're leading to all these things, and we hate to see them. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a positive aesthetic, in my case, sort of a religious, sort of traditional one, and impose that onto politics. So, and that's sort of the process that we're sort of going in. Now, as far as like imposing ideology on our religion, like I was guilty of that myself for like a long time. Like I said, I was trying to make God into like some sort of cosmic pawnbroker, and like
right.
we're all like things he has for sale, or he's trying to loan out at interest or something. But that's sort of like on a grand scale of sort of what can happen when you try to do that, when you take sort of an ideology and you try to sort of shoehorn your sort of religion into it. Now, sort of moving on beyond that, and that's kind of where I am today, sort of imposing my religion on the ideology. Well, what that essentially does is, in my case, it sort of ends up destroying ideology as kind of a useful concept. It's a useful concept insofar as to understanding sort of what other people are thinking and interesting different theories as to how sort of people think the world works or how the world should work in terms of political ideology specifically, not necessarily a worldview. But I think what I'm trying to do is see if there's, and it's difficult because in sort of like my corner of the internet, there's a whole bunch of people with like very divergent ideas about what they would like to see. Right. So we got constitutional conservatives, there's like Hoppian sort of libertarian types. There's like monarchists, there's tradcasts, there's like, neo-fascists and like stuff, and third positionists who want like sort of like sort of a type of national, sort of like not national socialism, Nazism, but like sort of like, again, a nationalist thing with like a strong welfare state with like a third position sort of economic model. And all these guys are like ostensibly on the right, and they're all sort of, again, loosely on sort of the same team. But I look at this and I just see a mess, right? I see a mess of different ideologies. And over there on sort of the left, we have like a mess of ideologies as well, right? But fortunately for them, unfortunately for us, they're sort of a lot more unified, right? Because with them, their values are sort of, I mean, they're pretty easy to understand. Equality, inclusivity, autonomy. That's sort of what they want. So I think sort of the struggle that we have sort of going forward is trying to kind of step over ideology to a certain extent. And so sort of, and I think the only way that can really be done is if you embrace a religious tradition instead and use that as your sort of guiding star. And then sort of when you have the same shared religious presuppositions as sort of your compatriots, then what that ends up doing is you can have disagreement about sort of how to execute a specific, right? And kind of the problem now with sort of the internet right and libertarians and so on and so forth is we don't even necessarily have the same goal other than we want to crush the left. Right? So that sort of puts us in an awkward position and sort of goes back to what I said earlier with kind of the challenge of our time is dealing with sort of a largely post-religious society or post-Christian, let's say post-Christian society, where now trying to find common ground and values about what's good and where to steer the ship and sort of how to go about doing that. I think that's sort of the challenge of our time. And if I look at sort of historical events in the 20th century, for example, where you would have maybe some guy sort of rise up and try to put order and sort of stick it to the left, like somebody like Francisco Franco or Salazar in Portugal. What would usually happen is you'd have kind of like all these different groups sort of like fighting each other. So you'd have the socialists and the communists and the anarchists over here. Yeah, exactly. ANCAPs. Back then, the anarchists were with the commies. And then today and then on the other side, you'd have monarchists and like Republicans and then like liberal fascists sort of like on this side. And then like a general pop up and be like, hey, I'm in charge. Let's go kill those guys. And like, all right, you know what? Better you than sort of them. And then afterwards, there's like a messy sort of struggle for power amongst sort of the winning side, like the nationalists versus the Republicans in the case of Spain. So I don't know if that can be avoided as sort of inevitable fighting of sides and whatnot. But I think in order to sort of minimize the fallout, let's say things do get dicey, like the boog happens, right? Let's say that happens and there's sort of a physical sort of struggle for power. And the advent of that, in order to sort of reduce the fallout, I think the only thing that could possibly sort of mitigate that is basically on some level shared religious conviction. So like, Catholics and Orthodox and like, base Protestants, they can be like, okay, like we have like some sort of doctrinal differences, but we can agree on some fundamental things for what we want for society. But I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but
no, this is a really interesting kind of thought exercise. Cause one thing that's been very interesting to me, again, being a total neophyte within Orthodoxy, it's been very interesting to me the way that it sounds silly almost to say it, like to hear myself saying it now, but that like Christianity is not one component of your paradigm. It is your entire paradigm.
Yes.
It is a
That's what I'm getting at.
Ground up, first principles, philosophical, complete whole philosophical paradigm.
Yeah. It's your whole worldview. Yeah.
Right.
So what are your politics, Orthodox?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so from there, then, if you're leading with if you're leading with this sounds very softy, but if you're leading with a servant's heart, if your goal is to serve your community, there's actually a pragmatic power attainment element to that, because the people that other people want to give power to are those whom they trust and those whom they are sure they're going to get something out of it. So the people who have developed a reputation or are known for their compassion, their sincerity, their willingness to sacrifice, those sorts of things, those are the people that other people want to be in power over them. So ultimately, I totally agree with what you're saying about like about having the shared essentially the shared tradition. It's kind of like that as things become more sharply divided, that shared tradition almost broadens. Like you there's the risk of watering down your tradition by expanding your borders too much, like intellectually speaking. But there's almost a degree to which like these are the times when people switch sides the most. Where when the rubber really meets the road, there's a lot of people who have this tradition or that tradition that they are just kind of like, oh, they're sort of interested in, but conflict, especially physical conflict, something like the boog, that's a crucible that burns off all of the dead wood. People get real serious about what they believe real fast. And so then if as Orthodox or as aspiring or inquiring Orthodox, if what we see is the absolute philosophical coherence of the Orthodox Christian view, then I think we can have faith that, again, as long as we're cultivating humility and following the leading of Christ, then whatever happens is what's supposed to happen. And we're going to be led to the point where we need to be led. And if there comes time where there needs to be a coalition of people who join together and work to fight off invaders or whatever. I mean, there's saints that I see every day when I'm looking at all the icons during the liturgy. I'm looking at all the icons on the wall. There's saints there who are holding swords. And these, I've read about some of them. These are guys who fought in armies, fought off invaders. Yeah. Like, this is definitely a part of the Christian tradition, taking up arms and fighting and defending your land. This is 100% a part of the Christian tradition. So, again, if you're remaining faithful and you're focused on a posture of service to your community and to the people who enter into your community, you're naturally going to be drawn into positions of leadership and into positions of power naturally by that.
That was good, man. So on to question 7. I think this is back on your I heard this on your podcast with the, what was that? What was the most recent one you did? Thinking Clearly. What was that again?
Let me look. I can look real quick here.
It was like the last one you did, I think. But
navigating a culture caught in a sense-making crisis.
Yeah. So I think I heard that on this. So he mentioned that libertarianism is essentially a legal theory. Mm. So I guess sort of as a legal theory, kind of what are your sort of biggest critiques of it as a legal theory in your current state of mind? So this is just some like red meat for the
I like this comment here that said anarchists are still with the communists, they just don't realize it.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'd say to just the most simplest, biggest critique of it as a legal theory is the fact that it doesn't port to society. It doesn't. There's the incentive structure is broken in such a way that people don't adopt it. In order to have an effective legal theory, you have to have buy-in, either from the people at large or the power centers. And typically it's the power centers. I'm not going to say it absolutely because I haven't considered every possible scenario, but for a legal theory to actually be effective, to actually port to the real world, it has to suit the interests of the powers that be. And there's a degree to which libertarianism actually does do that. It just comes at the cost of its own goals. That where again, it's like it's creating it creates political power vacuums, and that creates a pretext for people to step in and fill those power vacuums, and then act in act against the libertarian principles. So I'd say the biggest critique of libertarianism as a legal theory is that as of right now, it's entirely utopian, and that if you actually apply it to human societies, it degrades and falls apart, and there's no incentive, there's no built-in incentive for people to honor it and act within its bounds.
Yeah. No, that's very similar to sort of my critique of it as legal theory. Is this essentially it's rooted in an anthropology of man that doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah. That's everything I said in one sentence. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
So yeah, one of the things I mentioned in sort of one of my videos was that the problem with libertarianism is essentially the same one of the same problems with communism, oddly enough. So one of the reasons why the main reason why communism wouldn't work is that they were never able to create the new proletariat Soviet man.
Yep.
That was the goal of communism. Like, okay, so we have these people, we'll sort of build them in with this ideology. We'll sort of have them steeped in sort of Marxist thought. They'll think like workers. And then when that happens and we've shaken all the dead weight of the previous bourgeois paradigm, then, you know, they'll be ready then. But obviously that never happened because people are people. And just as the Soviets were never able to create the new Soviet man, anarchists, I don't think will ever be able to create the voluntarist man.
Right.
And that is really just boils down to that. So, and you can say, oh, well, yeah, but I mean, we got things for that. We got contracts and we got contract law, and then we got this and that, and we got the non-aggression principle and so on and so forth. There's ways to work around this. Okay. You know, like, go on, believe that. That's fine. But
prove it.
I did for years, you know, but exactly. So, I mean, when I look at society, what I see is essentially human societies are incredibly hierarchical, and people will say, well, animals are extremely hierarchical. The thing that's amazing about humans is the scale at which we have hierarchies. That's what makes sort of humans sort of amazing. And the scale of the hierarchies is also what makes us so awesome, right? Because we're able to organize vast groups of people. We're able to do amazing things that no one human can do with logistics, with, you know, the markets and so on and so forth, military endeavors, whatever, you name it. So that's sort of the thing. And also when you, again, sort of read the Bible, what you find is that humans are, you know, they're not inherently sinful, but they clearly have a fallen nature. So voluntarism is basically impossible with human beings as we are.
Yes.
And you could just look at that and say, you know, that's basically what it is now. And in terms of sort of how sort of society actually works, I mean, all you really need to do is like read, you know, Machiavelli or like the elite theorists like Pareto, Mosca, or Michels or Burnham, and you realize that most human beings, you know, unfortunately, yes, they're made in the image of God and whatnot, but a lot of them are essentially cattle. Like they're ballast to be like moved around, or I think as Carlyle said, like most people are sacks of potatoes to be picked up and moved by by whoever. So anyway,
but you could see this. This is why the NPC meme is so powerful, because most people are NPCs. Most people are they're not the independent, autonomous, self-directed sovereigns that libertarians. Can you hear me? You there?
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. I think I lost you there for a minute. You got me? I think we're both coming through. You just can't hear me.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Whew.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. This is African internet, man. Sorry. I'm just happy I don't have rolling blackouts right now.
Yeah.
So let me see. Okay. So last question, then we'll sort of hit a any super chats. So again, if you have any specific questions for Matt or myself, please leave a super chat, and then we'll sort of get to it as we can. Where as it is, we're over 2 hours, so we're going to wrap this up soon. So my last question to you is sort of, and this we've already sort of hinted at this a little bit, but practically speaking, we're talking practical now. Sort of, what do you think is the way sort of to go forward in the future for, let's call it, the right? So in America specifically, and what do we need to leave behind, and what do we need to take up? So what do we need to stop doing, and what do we need to start doing?
Okay. So practically, because I could go really impractical with this, practically speaking, leave behind, I think, it pains me to say this, but I think that the right needs to leave behind the idea of Americanism. I think that you can love the land, you can love the aspects of the mythology, but the idea that somehow we're going to restore the spirit of Americanism, that sort of thing, that's all. There's a bug that's in that idea that creates a like I'm not a software developer or whatever. I'm just going to use words I don't understand, but it like creates an exploit that allows leftism a backdoor to come back in. So I think that would probably be one of the biggest things is, I don't know, I guess I don't know exactly necessarily how practical that is. So to make it more applicable, I would say, rather than trying to think of ways to save the nation, to save the country, focus on ways to save your family. If you can get yourself, if you don't have a family, then find one. If you do have a family, then focus all of your time, effort, and energy on saving your family. Put your family in a place where you aren't beholden to, marauding invaders, wherever they're coming from. Put your family in a place where they are safe, where they're secure, where they're not beholden to the public school system. They're not beholden to, to landlords or whatever else, where you control. Is the thing with wealth, power, and influence that we talk about all the time, which is control the source of your income. That's what, if you want freedom, if you want to be free from these, oppression or anything like that, you've got to start by controlling the source of your income. Because if somebody else controls your income for you, then you can never be free. So you have to control the source of your income, and then you need to make that income mobile. You need to have a source of income that you can take anywhere. It may not necessarily be the exact income itself, but the means of acquiring that income. That's what building wealth is. Building wealth is building the capacity to generate an income no matter where you are and no matter what the economic system is. If the dollar collapses and is no longer a viable means of transacting, you should have a skill set or the capacity to earn whatever the currency is, to earn whatever it is. You should be someone who is valuable to any community that you're in. That's what true wealth is. So controlling the source of your income and accumulating wealth and preserving your family, protect your family. If you've done all of those things, if you've accomplished all of that, then you can start aiming higher to things like, trying to run for office or trying to start a movement of this kind or that kind. Like all of those things have to be secondary or tertiary behind getting yourself safe and protecting your family, and then work outwardly from there.
I think that's good. And from Dagbreaker, find yourself amongst people that respect the same traffic laws as you. Lol. Yeah, that's a big thing here in South Africa. Like it seems well, I won't say it. Never mind.
Yeah, I see where that's going.
But
trying to keep the YouTube channel, huh?
Yeah, I'm trying to keep the YouTube channel. But good point, Dagbreaker. No, I would definitely agree with that. And that's sort of the position I find myself in right now. Like we're sort of relocating and, changing sort of career trajectories and stuff. And it's largely sort of for what you're saying. So my goal is to sort of get my family secure first. And then from that point, sort of see where the Lord takes me. Because I do think there are things that can be done. Again, sort of like you said, especially at the local level. So I guess that would be sort of my, as I understand things, sort of the way moving forward is to, first off, preserve yourself, preserve your family, but then not only once you've got that settled, create nodes, pockets of resistance, essentially wherever you find yourself. And that really involves networking. And one of the main reasons why I'm so glad that I've sort of lived in South Africa for this time is, in a certain sense, South Africa is sort of like the future for a lot of places. And I'm living in the future right now in terms of just sort of having an overtly sort of hostile government, which is sort of sclerotic and, bogged down by its own incompetence. But at the same time, you're seeing all these amazing like parallel organizations and societies rise up. Things like Afroform and Sakaliga, which I've talked about multiple times on the stream, which are basically like organizations with, like 300,000 members who contribute monthly, and they basically engage in constant lawfare against the state and do private security, and they're a business network, and so on and so forth. Things like these are real sort of power centers, because when you do have that sort of organizational capacity, then, you're able to do amazing things. And here in South Africa, a lot of these organizations are run by Afrikaners. Now in America, I'm not there's not a whole lot of ethnic in-group preference amongst sort of, people like us, let us say. But what you definitely could do is you could sort of make it a faith-based thing. And I think that's actually the healthy way to do it. Sort of be like, we are the Orthodox men of California fraternal organization, and this is what we do, and this is sort of what we fight against, and we're a nonprofit, and we got paying members, and here's how we're making a difference. Things like that. So, and as far as the national stuff, I still don't have an idea. Pray, think about it, and hopefully God will sort of lead you through. So
yeah, amen.
Yeah,
like I mentioned my friend Popular Liberty earlier, and he has his theory of archetropism. He also has he has some really interesting ideas of stuff that he's putting, like ideas he's putting together that could be for people who are ready to actually start taking action with stuff in their local communities, who've already accomplished everything we talked about, and they're like, okay, I control the source of my income. I've got my family secure. If the boog breaks out, I'm already taken care of. I know I can take care of myself, my family, my community, and I'm ready for something more. He's got some really interesting stuff that he's working on, and I'm being kind of a little intentionally vague just because some of this is just like OPSEC and everything. So if you're someone who's in that position, who's interested in that, then I just look up Popular Liberty on Twitter, or on YouTube, on Twitter too. The name is there's a pun in the name. It's like it's tongue in cheek. So don't it's meant to signal like cringeness kind of. But
okay.
so his name's Andrew. So he's got some really interesting ideas that he's working on, and he's broken some of them down on his YouTube channel. One of them is called the Anti-Tax, and it's a way
that's a really cool idea.
Yeah. It's a way of basically privatizing taxation and rearranging the incentive structure of government funding. And those are the kinds of things that, like, if you can get a foothold in like red areas of red states, and you can get together a group of like Orthodox men who we work together, we provide security services for our communities. We're
like Christian Jews. We just work together.
Right. Yeah. There's a reason that model has persisted, because it's effective.
It works. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But thinking tribally is a big thing, because humans are tribal creatures. We're not. Individualism and collectivism is another false dialectic. Yeah. Ultimately, human beings are tribal. So if you start thinking tribally, then you'll begin acting tribally, and that's much more adaptive for the long-term success of human communities.
Excellent. Now I see we have one last super chat here from Peter Young. $2. Thanks, man.
Oh
You
boy.
should listen to the Lord of Spirits podcast. I have not actually. Most of my Orthodox is that an Orthodox podcast?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, most of my Orthodox podcasts I listen to Jay Dyer, kind of the OG Ortho Bro, and then I listen to Roosh, and I listen to Brother Augustine, and then there's another guy I like called Father Spiridon Bailey, who gives these nice homilies. Another dude, what was his name? Barnabas Powell. Yeah, that's his name.
That's a good name.
Yeah, he's an excellent preacher because he used to be a Baptist minister and he converted to Orthodoxy, and now he's a priest, and he gives these awesome 10-minute Baptist style sermons,
like fire and brimstone Orthodoxy.
yeah. It's like really cool. I love the aesthetic, and he's like a plump Southern guy who looks a bit like Friar Tuck. I love it.
Father Josiah just told me about a podcast from a spiritual brother of his or something. That's a guy's name is Father Joseph Honeycutt, and he's from North Carolina. He's in Houston, and his podcast is called Orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Father Joseph Honeycutt. Oh
yeah.
My gosh, that's so great. That's the most. I mean, the name just evokes images of sweet tea. It's great.
Lord of Spirits that was really my biggest introduction to Orthodoxy. That's what really got me going. It's if you start listening to it, go back to the very beginning and listen to all of them in order. Basically, it's it's kind of like a study of the Book of Enoch to an extent, but it's a study of all of Scripture. But they go through how would you say this? It's like a study of
canon, or
it's a study of angels and demons, and they have a series on the what a body means in the Bible when it talks about God's body. They talk about their big thing is giants. They've got lots of inside jokes, but they talk about the Nephilim. They talk about demons.
I'm subscribing right now.
Yeah, it's the first few episodes. They have kind of some audio issues, and I know of people who've started listening, they're I can't get through it. Work through it. It's worth it. Once they get into it, then they've done episodes on Leviathan and Behemoth, Halloween episodes on demons and stuff. And one of the guys is it's two Orthodox priests. One of them is Father Andrew Stephen Damick. The other one is Father Stephen DeYoung, and they're part of ancient faith. And there's kind of some issues with ancient faith especially if you follow Brother Augustine, you'd be aware of them. But so far, I haven't encountered anything that really was and Father Stephen DeYoung in particular, he's a guy that's he's a total sci-fi nerd. He's the type of guy that speaks Klingon and has studied Middle Earth extensively, treating it as a hobby. Well, he's taken all of that passion and he's directed it towards studying ancient Semitic languages and studying the pagan religions and their practices at the time around, the first 2,000 years BC. And so he brings that historical context to understanding the Torah, and it frames everything in just a completely different light. And you find out that giants are really the story of the entire Bible. The entire Bible all revolves around the story of the Nephilim. It's a very, very interesting.
Oh, man.
It'll change the way you view the world.
I'm super interested. It sounds esoteric and super thick, super dense. So now I'm looking forward to that. And from Al Hizzy, he just says, on the national front, ride the tiger. Yeah, I think that's basically what we have to do. Just sort of hold on to that tiger and don't let go.
Right.
Because he's going to eat you. All right. So I guess that's about it, man. So let's close with some plugs. What do you got? Where can you find you? How can people dig more of this jive nonsense?
So for the most part, all of the stuff we've been doing is a YouTube show. So you can just find Kingpilled on YouTube, KINGPILLED. I started uploading some of the podcasts, so some of them as audio podcasts. So I think we've got a half a dozen or so, and I'm in the process of trying to get everything else uploaded. It's just I've had bigger priorities. Then I'm most active on social media on Twitter at Real Kingpilled. That's where I do the majority of my shit posting and such. And then yeah, we have a supporting listeners group on Subscribestar if you want to sign up there. Subscribestar.com/Kingpilled. And we've got a Discord server that it's full of one thing about our chat on Kingpilled is I'm just continuously blown away by the quality of the commentary, the quality of the people who are commenting on our chat are smarter than I am, like easily. And
it's really nice to have a high IQ audience. It's nice.
Yeah,
because then you actually learn stuff from them.
Exactly. Yeah, and then
not just cat videos.
Right. And then a bunch of them joined our supporting listeners group. So it's just this chat of like, I sit there and I just learn stuff from these guys. And so I'm very blessed by being surrounded by really quality people. And yeah, those will be my plugs. I appreciate you having me on, man. This was a lot of fun.
Excellent. Me too. No, I had a blast. Time zoomed right on by. All right. I guess house cleaning for me. New video will be out tomorrow. I'm going to try and finish the audio tonight and put it together. It's going to be on, what was it? Oh yeah, Why the Left Can't Meme. So I'm going to be taking it into all sorts of different areas. We're going to be talking about logos a little bit. We're going to be talking a bit about truth. We're going to be talking a bit about comedy, things like that. Do a couple of meme analyses and whatnot. But I think you guys will enjoy it. As far as new stuff, I don't have anything else planned immediately. I'll try and maybe put together another stream sometime next week. For those of you who have been longtime viewers, you may have noticed I haven't been making a ton of stuff, but yeah, since my Alaska trip, I've kind of put me in hit me with a bit of writer's block and thought about my life quite a bit. So, but I'm going to be making sort of more regular content now. But yeah, so if you haven't watched my all secular marriage is gay marriage video, you can check that out. The video tonight, of course. And then we got the other one on Why the Left Can't Meme analysis. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do. You can join Subscribestar for as little as 2 dineros a month. And thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll talk to you next time. Patriarch out.